everybody. Yeah, I was just making sure that we had all our presenting information set correctly, and looks like we're all here. And I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a fair number of people that are arriving as we speak, so that's exciting to see everybody here. Let me go ahead and just introduce myself real quick. I'm Brian Blackman. I'm a product development team lead here at GPA, headquartered in sunny and petroleum product free North Carolina. So welcome everybody. We're really excited to get going today and dive into our topic and our subject matter. One thing I do want to let everyone know that at the top right, you've already found the comments area. That's awesome. Blow that up. Let's see a lot of good sharing back and forth in there. Just to the right of that, you'll have a questions option as well. If you have questions for our guests today, feel free to throw them in there. I'll be monitoring that. We'll see if we can get that in and get them answered directly from our experts. Like I said, I'm super excited to introduce our guest today. First, let me go ahead and introduce our first guest. And really, he's a man who needs little introduction in the world of cybersecurity. He's a published author of Hacking Exposed and renowned public speaker. He is the father of gamified cybersecurity training with this masterpiece, Red versus Blue. Also, 3-letter government agencies, foreign and domestic, refer to him by his first name alone. He is the most interesting man in cybersecurity. Founder and CEO of ThreatGEN, Mr. Clint Bodigen. Welcome, Clint.
Thank you. That was a really embellished intro, and I appreciate it.
Well, full disclosure, I didn't write these. I'm just reading them. So I might have tweaked them a bit, but, got to have a little fun. Our other guest, he's a member of the Industrial Control System Joint Working Group and Control Systems Cybersecurity Association International. He has over 24 years of industrial experience, industrial control, network infrastructure, data center and planning, ICS cybersecurity. He is the OG of OT, Director of Information Systems at GPA, and GPA Identified Product Manager, Bill Metcalf. Welcome, Bill.
Awesome. Thanks for the great introduction, Brian.
You're welcome. Awesome. So, let's dive into risk management. And Clint, let's just give our audience a brief understanding of, what we mean by it's all about risk.
Yeah. So I think when we look at the title of this presentation, right, we're talking about a practical approach to industrial risk management. And this first topic tees that up because let's face it, when we talk about risk management, industrial risk management, it's not the sexiest thing in the room, right? I mean, right now the hot topics are threat monitoring and threat intelligence and all that good stuff. And it seems like risk is one of those subjects that people just avoid and don't want to talk about. But, when we're looking at risk and how to make risk management practical, because we'll look at all these things in this conversation today about like these big best practice statements, like layered defense and all these things. And how do you do it all? It all starts with risk. And that's why that's the first topic, which is everything is about risk. We don't do cybersecurity just because it's cool. I mean, according to my intro, I do, but it's cybersecurity, isn't about chasing the adversary down and like the movie Black Hat, right? I mean, I don't know of any cybersecurity expert that looks like Chris Hemsworth running around with a godlike body and gun-toting adventures, right? I think if that actually did happen, I think I wouldn't survive. So the bottom line is that we do it because cyber is a vector to the risk of either the business or production, right? I mean, it's a safety risk, production risk, business reputation. And so everything that we do in cyber, it's just another risk management solution. And I know that sounds boring, but we'll get into that, right? And so to kind of finish out my comment is that whether you're making decisions in life or your marriage or with your kids or in business or industrial, it all comes down to everybody kind of wants to know these basic things, right? What is my risk? Whatever it is I'm doing, what's the risk? What is the impact of that risk happening or something going wrong? What's the likelihood it could go wrong? And how do I deal with that or mitigate it with the resources that I have available to me? That's the 42, right? That's the golden question of everything that you ever do in life, and it applies here too. So if we put everything into that context, that's going to guide us going forward into how do we make this thing practical? So I'll turn it over to Bill for comment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Clint. When we think about risk and we think about everything that's going on, I've been doing this a long time. I've been to a lot of different manufacturing verticals. In every place I go, there are key cornerstones of every business. There's safety, there's the ability to do production, there's reputation, all of these key things. And, maybe 10, 15 years ago, the vectors weren't there. The internet, this proliferation of malware, ransomware, this kind of thing didn't really exist. And so the risk was relatively small. But things have changed, right? And it's to the point that it's going to affect the core processes of your business. It's going to have a negative impact. And that's why it is so important. And with everything going on, everybody either should be saying, I've got to get a plan in place, or I really need to be reevaluating my plan, because I see all of these companies that have, they're large companies, large resources, and large technology groups are still getting infiltrated. So it is about the risk, and it's about understanding your assets and what it is you're trying to protect. So I'm kind of stoked, to get the opportunity to talk about this, and hopefully it won't be just a boring conversation. To reiterate what Brian had said, the questions, this is designed to be a conversation. So, we want to keep on topic as much as we can. But if you have those questions, stick them over in the questions area. Brian will be kind of watching those questions and kind of feed them in as they come in. So.
Yeah, I'll fire them out. And, we talk about quantifying risk. Clint, just kind of expand a little bit on how will we go about quantifying the risk that we have at our facilities?
The golden question, right? So I think, first of all, take all of the standards like NIST 800, the 37 and 39, the risk portion. I know 853, 82, all that, but talking about the risk portion. So it's going to be your NIST 837, 39. There's some old ISA 99 stuff dealing with risk, and 62443. Take all the stuff and all the heat maps and throw it out, because ultimately, and when I say that, I mean this global perspective, this global perception of this is how we score and quantify risk. Because the secret is, and especially to making it practical and pragmatic for your situation, is that you have to localize it. When it comes to scoring risk and quantifying risk, nobody can do it better than you. You know your environment, you know your business. When it comes to prioritizing risk, right? Only you know the criticalities of your systems. Only you know what the consequences are for your systems. So you have to localize it. And when you're prioritizing those systems, when you're quantifying the risk, it doesn't matter if you're using Formula A or Formula B. All that matters is that you're staying consistent and using the same formula throughout your entire organization, because ultimately, what is risk quantification for? It's simply so that you can prioritize your risks, figure out what the risk, the consequence, and the impact is, prioritize that so that you can deal with the risk with the resources that you have available to you. It's about creating an efficient and cost-effective risk mitigation strategy. And it's all about locally what it means to you, right? I mean, so there's this whole concept of global predictive risk analysis from global intelligence, and the likelihood that this target, yes, there's a piece of that, but 90% of risk quantification is local to you and to your organization. Bill?
Right.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think a lot of it, a lot of times people get hung up in the word risk, and many times it comes down to consequence, impact, right?
Yeah.
So, in the manufacturing world, we have high pressures, we have chemicals, we have environmental concerns, we have all of these things. And so it's probably more about gauging your risk based on your impacts, and being able to quantify those. And, Clint, I couldn't agree more. You have to have some way to build a score, to set a benchmark, right? To have that where am I at today? And then, of course, because cybersecurity is one of those iterative things, we have to keep going over it again and again by establishing that benchmark, maybe comparing that to a standard, and then having something to work off, and to be continuously reevaluating and working towards improving your cybersecurity posture, I think is key to being successful in protecting your assets, protecting your business objectives, right?
Right. And when I said, take that and throw it out the window and everything, what I mean is you can use it. It's fine. but you have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to understand that, God forbid I say, even heat maps are okay now and then, but as long as they make sense to you, and as long as you can use them, if they're of value to you, right? So, and that's what it's about. And by the way, the last thing I want to say, but kind of before I think we're getting to the point where we're moving on to the next subject or whatever, but I do want to say that, you know, as fortuitous as it may have been, you know, we planned this webinar a couple months ago, several weeks ago, and it just so happens now everybody wants to talk about the recent incident and everything like that. And the one thing I will say is that whether you go back to the Ryuk ransomware a couple of years ago, if you talk about SolarWinds, if you talk about the Florida water plant incident, and now Colonial, all of this goes back to common denominators. And, you know, I don't want to get into speculation or even details, but I will get into common denominators, and that there are common successes and common failures amongst all of these, that I think that if we will take the lessons learned and put them into that pragmatic, localized process that you need to establish, you can prevent that from happening in your own organization. So I'll leave it at that.
That's awesome. Yeah. You know, quantifying a risk is one thing. Being able to measure how successfully you're mitigating that risk is a totally another thing. And that's probably something we might dive into when we talk a little bit about the tools involved. But let's go ahead and jump to our next topic. We're going to bring up the slide here. It's something that, you know, we'll spend a little bit of time on, but, you know, planning your assessment. Bill, I kind of want your take first on this. If you can talk a little bit about the importance of planning your risk assessment, and maybe even executing a risk assessment.
Sure. So, you know, again, if we follow what best practices tell us, you know, the kind of the starting point in your cyber journey is you need to do an assessment. You have to understand what it is you're trying to protect. You have to quantify, you know, as we said, you have to quantify what your risks are, what those potential impacts to a cyber event, what that impact would be to your local system. You know, and a lot of times this is like eating an elephant, right? Because again, if you go out and you look at the, you know, IEEE standards, you go to SANS Institute, you look at the NIST standard, it is a massive undertaking. And traditionally, you know, it involves a lot of legwork, and you know, it's manpower of somebody going out, going through control rooms, opening cabinet doors, documenting assets, going through gathering software lists, trying to quantify what known vulnerabilities are associated with software, firmware versions, and basically, you know, to go through that process to first gather all the information, to compile it into a meaningful report, publish the report. Then by the time the decision makers get that, you know, it's a stale report, and so it's very costly. And so I think that one of the keys, you know, with modern technology, we have to improve on this process so that we're looking at things in a more dynamic real time, or as close to real time as possible. But assessments that base information, and that information changes, right? You know, whether it's the impact, whether it's the assets out on the floor. And so I think the key to planning is first of all, identifying those key pieces that you're going to do, what the impact is, and of course frame that in a process flow, if you will, of your specific facility, and how that impact will happen. So if a specific system gets affected, will that affect the whole process? Will it only affect a small part of the process? So I think that's also key to that beginning, that planning phase. Clint, what do you think?
So I'm going to look at it from a little bit different perspective. I want to look at the overwhelming pieces that, or the pieces that people often find overwhelming, and kind of give you some tips and tricks on how to scale that down and look at it from a different perspective, so it's not that huge elephant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, first of all, I think a lot of people get the terminology crossed up, from like risk assessment, vulnerability assessment, pen test. So many times I'll have customers say, well, I need a pen test, but then the deliverables they're asking for is from a risk assessment or a vulnerability assessment, or they'll say, you know, I need a gap analysis, and then they want a risk quantification. And so it's really important to understand one thing. All of these terms, these definitions, whether you're doing a vulnerability assessment, a pen test, whether you're red teaming or purple teaming or whatever. All of this is meant to gather data to go into your risk equations. It is all part of a risk assessment. And that's the bottom line, is everything is a risk assessment. And then each of these pieces, vulnerability assessment, a gap analysis, a pen test, forget about the nomenclatures. You could call it, pink and purple polka dotted elephant assessment. I don't care. The bottom line is the data that you're gathering is important, right? Because all this data, if somebody comes to you and just says, well, I need a pen test, and you're like, well, what do you want? Well, we just need a pen test. I mean, ultimately, it's about what are you going to do with that data? And you want to understand that data has to have value, right? You're wasting your time and you're wasting your money if the data that you're gathering is not going towards your overall risk equation. What's the purpose of a risk? What's the purpose of that risk equation and a risk assessment? It's to be able to most efficiently and most cost effectively mitigate that risk. And layered defense is great. Everybody talks about layered defense, and most people can't afford all those layers with time or people or whatever. So you have to have an efficient and a cost-effective approach to doing this. And so that's what it's all about in essence. And I have another comment, but I think it goes in the next section. But so that's what you need to think about. It doesn't matter what you call it. You need to understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and what you're going to do with the data.
Yeah, and it's not just checking the box, right? You got to really take advantage of the information you're getting from any type of assessment. And one pertinent part of that is either companies are just spending all their capital expenditure on assessments, and they never get to the protection, the intrusion detection, and all the other things they need to do. And then on the other side, people just don't even do the assessment, so they're just throwing in protection devices and intrusion detection devices and thinking they're providing that layer of defense that you're talking about. Can you guys speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it all comes down to how much protection do you need? What's the goal? Are you trying to prevent the risk from happening, or are you trying to reduce the impact? And that's where that cost benefit analysis comes in. And ultimately, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit, because I guess I'll tee up a hint at where I want to go with this next conversation, which is when it comes to OT, industrial, ICS, whatever nomenclature we're using this decade, it all boils down to you need to start in engineering first. Cybersecurity isn't something new. Cybersecurity and risk management isn't something new we're trying to teach the engineers, right? They've been doing it for a long time, right? These process hazards analysis and HAZOPs. So you start with the risk assessment and mitigation. Start with engineering and work your way out. And you need to consider when you're planning this, cyber is another vector. It's another hazard. But you need to perform your risk assessment like you would in any other operations environment. But again, it's going to bleed into the next topic. So I'll pass over to Bill before moving on.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess as we're getting ready to move on to the next one, that risk assessment is your opportunity to prioritize. Not everybody has unlimited budgets. Sometimes it may be a question of, am I going to invest? Do I need to invest money in an intrusion detection system, firewall, something like that? Or am I buying instrumentation for my process? By doing an effective assessment, allows you to make that informed decision, right? It's taking that real world data of what my risk is, what it is I'm trying to protect, how things are interconnected, so that I have the information to make that informed decision and be able to prioritize, where I spend my resources, where I spend my manpower and my money and that type of thing.
Right. We really need to know, what's our weakest link, right? We can patch all types of assets. We can stand up all kinds of firewalls, but if we don't find that and fix that one most vulnerable and most risk impactful link, then really what are we doing, right? So the information piece is huge.
Yeah, and a lot of times, that very vulnerable piece that can impact the whole system, bring the whole facility down, gets overlooked because it's hard to justify, right? There is no ROI on buying a new switch or buying a firewall or doing network segment. There is no profit margin in that. But where you're going to save your money is in that event that something happens, either being able to completely defend it, or at least be able to have a tactical advantage to stop it and mitigate it as soon as it happens. And that's, that's that key in doing a targeted approach is you got to understand where to invest your time, your money, and your efforts.
Speaking of targeted approach, great segue. Clint,
Yeah.
I know you're just chomping at the bit to dive into this piece,
Yeah,
right?
it is a perfect segue because so yeah, how do you create a targeted approach? If you look at this and you say, okay, risk is a big subject, and now I understand it's all about risk, and I understand that all these pieces and this data is going to fit into there, so how do I organize it to where it's a targeted approach and to where it is practical? And there's just a few things you need to understand. And that is, the first thing you need to understand are what are your most critical systems. From there, you need to understand what are the consequences and impact of a failure or a loss of that system. Once you can, and that is much easier to quantify than how vulnerable is this system or what is my attack surface and all that. So you have to start with what is the cost of impact, the cost of loss for most critical systems. Then you have to start to understand, well, okay, how do I treat this? Do I want to completely remove the risk? And when I say remove the risk, I mean do I want to cut the access vector? So if it's a cyber vulnerability, do I want to prevent access to it? If it's do I want to install a safety system to stop the impact, or do I want to implement something that reduces the overall impact, the overall cost of that? And so that's where you start to do your cost benefit analysis. You start to understand, well, what's it going to cost to completely mitigate? What's it going to cost to reduce the impact of that overall the cost of the incident, right? And so you compare those, and that's what you're looking at. And so, and then at that point, now let's kind of bring that into more recent events, right? So to a lot of operators, this sounds just like, okay, well, this is what we've been doing for decades, right? We go in there and we figure out what the consequences are and what the impact is, and we apply the appropriate safety systems and et cetera. So if you consider now cyber is sort of kind of a new hazard in a new vector, now you're going to be looking at things like let's look at more recently, more appropriately. So in addition to the risk assessment, you have a proactive approach, and then you have kind of a reactive approach, which is, well, let's look and see if we already have a potential actor. Let's look, do we have a potential risk? So because you have to look at the fact that if you're already breached, then that's going to increase the likelihood equation. That increases the likelihood that this is going to happen. How big is your attack footprint? That increases the likelihood. Everybody says likelihood is hard to measure. But if you localize it and you look, well, if I have an attack vector with 50 vulnerabilities, that's going to increase the likelihood that thing's going to get hit. Or if I have 50 vulnerabilities and 5 different connections to that thing, that increases the likelihood that that's going to get hit. If I'm already breached, that increases the likelihood that that thing's going to get hit or something's going to happen. So identify your critical assets, identify the consequences and impact and the cost thereof, identify the different solutions to reduce or remove that risk or the impact, and then identify where are your attack vectors? Where are the vulnerabilities? Am I already breached? So look at your attack vector. I would equate your attack vectors now, your attack vectors and your threats is your likelihood equation. That when people are trying to figure out how to figure out that likelihood. So, and I'll pause there.
Yeah, pause there. Bill, jump in, and then I got a couple of questions we're going to throw at you guys.
Well, go ahead and take the questions, and then.
Well, the first one's from everybody's friend Scott McNeil, and he wants to know, what do you guys consider most important? Solid infrastructure with proper segmentation, both logical and physical, or some fancy software to lay over the top everything to watch it all, key being AI?
Yes.
Good answer.
Yes.
Elaborate, please.
I'll let you go first, Bill.
Okay, so obviously, good segmentation. Those are best practices. Those are things that we can do to be effective. But you know, it's kind of part and parcel, right? So if you think about the work that we do, so we do good segmentation, and then we throw firewalls, we throw in all these software packages, whether it's AI or something like that. Somebody still has to have responsibility to monitor those packages and to validate, you know, if it's a software situation, you've got to validate the information that it's doing. If you got segmentation, somebody still has to be watching those systems to detect if there is an issue, and you know, when do we implement that plan to you know, activate our cyber kill chain, you know, to disconnect or whatever within segmentation. So I think the two kind of go part and parcel, really. You know, again, from a and it was interesting that he used the term reliability, because at the end of the day, you know, we're talking about reliability, right? Because if you think, you know, you can talk about worms and all these different things and ransomware and stuff, but basically what we're defending against is somebody taking our software and systems that control our processes, our environmental controls, all of these things, our safety systems, and cause them to work in a manner in which they're not intended to, right? So, you know, reliability is a big thing. Segmentation goes a long way towards reliability, and a lot of times maybe that's the thought that those who are not tech savvy, cyber savvy, everything that you do in cyber is going to improve your system reliability. Does that make sense?
That's clear as mud, don't you think, Clint? What you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think that the reason I said yes is because there is no one answer to what is more important, this or that. It depends on your situation. And what I mean by that is, if you're already breached, threat monitoring is not going to do you any good. You're just going to watch them take your stuff. Okay. You know, I always tell people that's like putting the alarms on a half-framed house. And so but you know, if you're already pretty good and you already have some systems in place, some network segmentation, you know, adding more security, more software may not be the right answer. Maybe now you need to get visibility, you need to get some threat monitoring, you need to get some situational awareness going on in there. Or let's say, here's a very controversial flip side. Network segmentation might not do you any good if you're allowing physical access directly into the control room, right? I mean, network segmentation isn't going to do any good against a physical, or if you're already allowing access, or you're allowing people with USBs to come into your control room or into your process control network and things like that. And so, number one, it's a combined effort, but number two is you have to look at your situation and you have to apply your controls where necessary to meet your situation, because they're all important, but sometimes they're less important compared to another one, depending on your situation, which is why it has to be targeted. You have to look at the situation, and yeah.
Perfect. Got another question here. There are many players on the internet to offer network risk assessment. Is there any qualification or certification that would make one stand out from others? Maybe Bill wants to jump on that one. I'm not familiar with any. Are you?
So yeah, I guess you could go a lot of different directions with that question. You know, I am not aware of a software certification agency or keeper of software certification. I think that if you're shopping around and you know, maybe this is jumping ahead to the tool section, maybe that would better be, why don't we hold off till the tool section to jump on that one?
Okay. Yeah, but we'll revisit it because I have an answer for that too.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But while we're still on target, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say, just to kind of circle back around on that targeted approach, it goes back to what I think Clint said at the beginning is again, you know, doing an assessment, planning that assessment, and taking a targeted approach. the targeted approach that you take, you don't know what the target approach is until you do the assessment, until you understand what it is you're trying to protect, what it is you're trying to protect against. And so again, that starting from the beginning, don't start in the middle. Gather the information and then quantify where the impacts will have the biggest effect. And those are going to be where you start to target. And then, if the right solution is segmentation, if the right solution is a firewall, if it, whatever that right fit is for you in your current situation. And so,
let me add one thing to that, because there's one thing that we said about the targeted approach and, localizing and things like that. I will retract one thing I said about using global threat intelligence data to justify likelihood and things like that. And so the caveat I have to that is, if you are an industrial operator with certain systems and certain processes, and there's clear evidence that there's a group out there targeting your type of company, your type of systems and everything else, you can use that as a pretty good indicator that they're targeting systems and companies like yours. So there's a good, it's pretty good likelihood that you're at risk, right? I don't, can't give you a percentage, but there's some sort of likelihood. For example, like right now, ransomware is on the rise, and especially with big game hunting right now. So, if you're an industrial operator with lax security, you can bet you are at risk, right? And so there is that aspect to it. And the reason I bring it up during the targeted section is because sometimes using the misfortune of others is to your advantage. Looking at other people's impacts and incidents and other impacts is an indicator as to what the impact of your loss could be. So I'll throw that out there.
Yeah, there's tons of examples, unfortunately, out there. Not all of them get reported, but the ones that do, you can tell they're huge deals and nothing to take lightly. So I think it is coming on the radar from a lot of people's perspective in the industrial space. Let's go ahead and jump into the next one here. And this is going to be a lot of information, hopefully, about the tools that we can use to help us with this approach. I don't know which one of you guys wants to jump on this one first.
Let me throw my 2 cents into the previous question about it, if there's any type of software or certification and all that stuff like that, right? So back in the day, you had the Achilles certification, right? And then you have your WIB, and you've got ISA Secure, and so you have all these things that certify software and whatnot. And the bottom line is that when it comes to certifications of vendors, software, whatnot, this is my opinion, is that it's all just somebody's opinion. You can have a bunch of measurable criteria and all this sort of thing, but outside of a standardized litmus test that's the same for everybody in every circumstance, to me, I think vendor certification and qualification of who's best is sort of like the Grammys or the Emmys, right? It's for show, and I think it's for advertising and marketing, and it is kind of like those pay awards, right? You've been awarded the CEO of the year from Timbuktu.com magazine, and it's just like, it doesn't really matter. If you really want to know, how do you figure out what's the best, and what you should be using if it's qualified? It's good old fashioned network marketing and word of mouth. I mean, if referenceable customers is the best way to know whether something's going to work or not. And by the way, just because one tool doesn't work for you or doesn't work for company A doesn't mean it's not perfect for company B. There's a lot of specializations out there where there's some great tools out there that may not fit your needs, but this tool over here that somebody else doesn't like is perfect. I mean, just like threat monitoring tools and situational awareness tools, there's a lot of specializations and caveats and everything like that, and they all have their place. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. So I guess talking about tools, and this is something that we often have discussions with our customers about. So there are a lot of tools on the market, and there are a lot of tools that were designed, and their lineage comes from the IT world, right? So they're what we consider IT-centric tools. And these are wonderful tools, and they can be deployed, and they can provide meaningful information. Because, we're talking about, in an assessment type of situation, we're talking about understanding our IT-based assets, right? Our computers, our networks, our infrastructure, the hardware, and the things that are connected to it. The issue that we have with so many tools is, in many manufacturing systems, there are legacy systems, and legacy systems oftentimes do not tolerate being poked, prodded, and interrogated for their information. And so there is definitely risk. We talk about wanting to eliminate risk and mitigate risk by doing an assessment. We want to be careful that the tools that we bring into this space to help us are not going to introduce risk. And as I said earlier, the kind of the flip side to that is doing it manually. If you do it manually, it's time consuming, and time is money, right? So it's time consuming, it's expensive, and you end up with stale data. And I hate to take the shameless plug, but I think this is the point to do that, right? We as system integrators have been doing this forever. And we have put together tools that are specifically designed for that OT environment, that are safe. They've been tested, they're passive. And so any tools that you're selecting, they need to be of that passive nature. They need to be OT friendly. And they need to be, something that's quantifiable, right? So, oftentimes you think about, and I know people, what is the term? Secure checkbox security type of thing. There are packages out there that can be very speculative. Having a tool set that you can use that will be standards based, will be safe for the OT environment, and will be something quantifiable. Clint, do you have some feedback, some input on that?
Yeah, and so I'd like to think of myself as a disinterested third party here when it comes to the tools, because we don't make these types of tools, and so but we use them a lot, and we use a lot of different ones. And I think one of the things that you said, which is really important, is OT friendly, because we really only operate, when we do assessments, we only operate in the OT environments. The only reason we would go in an IT environment is when it's attached to an OT environment. And let's be clear, a lot of OT threats are born in IT, right? They use IT as a pivot. And so you're going to have cross tool, you're going to have cross functionality in tools and cross functional requirements. So it's important that your tool does operate safely in an OT environment. And so I think, when you're trying to identify the perfect tool, it really is looking about two things. Number one, is it an OT environment, and is it safe for OT? And number two, is it truly risk quantification, right? And that's a big thing, because a lot of people go out there and use a tool that's popular and free out there. It's just a gap analysis tool. It's a standards assessment tool. It doesn't provide risk quantification. And it goes back to what I said before. What are you doing this for? If you're just gathering data and you're saying, oh, I got some gaps, here they are, that doesn't go very far at all to helping you understand how to prioritize fixing these or what it does to the overall bottom line. And so it's really important when you're trying to identify those tools.
Yeah, it's awesome. It really kind of gets back to that holistic approach. And if we can just kind of summarize the categories of tools that we're talking about for this target approach, we know that there's detection tools. We know that there's prevention tools, monitoring tools. You just kind of list out the standard tool categories, if you will, and then we'll kind of dive into ones that are interesting to you guys.
Oh, you're asking us?
Clint or Bill, yeah.
Well,
Talk over each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think, ultimately it's all about, they're all risk assessment or risk analysis or risk mitigation, risk management tools, right? But yeah, I think it comes down to, there's the preventative tools, there's the assessment tools, and there's the kind of the monitoring tools, right? And I think for this discussion, number one, you have to look at all the assessment tools really feed into the risk tools. I think let's keep the monitoring tools, the active monitoring, unless you want to go there, like the threat monitoring tools, keep that outside, because the threat monitoring is in some aspects it's proactive and in some aspects it's reactive, right? Depends on the situation. If you're using a threat monitoring tool and it's always on and active, and if you're using that to feed into like a living active risk score, that's one thing. Otherwise, let's keep it out. Let's just talk about the tools that help you quantify your risk and manage your risk. I think ultimately there's a practicality, and then there's a kind of a managerial area. Number one, you want it to be able to properly help you quantify the risk. Because the biggest thing is a framework, right? I used to do vulnerability assessments and risk assessments, and before we had all these, we had tools like Archer or Arc or whatever it was, and back in the day, and they weren't OT specific. And I think we were using like GRC tools, like just government risk compliance tools, like RSAM and Modulo and all that. And before all that, it was just spreadsheets, and you're trying to figure out how to quantify all this, and you needed a framework to put all this in. So first and foremost, your tool is a framework to house all of this data you're gathering to put in, and then you have to be able to take that data and turn it into something quantifiable, to be of value, to be of meaning for you, to be able to quantify, prioritize your mitigations and all that.
Right.
So that's the two things you want your tool to do. Another thing the tool should do is, when you're talking about a dual purpose tool, if it's a framework and that's repository, it should also kind of help you manage your asset inventory and help you get a lay of the land and monitor that, because I don't know if you've heard of SolarWinds, but I mean, that's kind of gone now. So you might need a replacement for that. Just kidding. But I think, when you're talking about a risk management tool, what are the targets? It's your assets. It's everything, right? So I think your risk management tool that's quantifying your risk should also have awareness of your assets. So I think those are kind of like the three big things for me that a risk kind of management tool should do. And you want to comment, Bill?
Yeah, and Bill, comment on the difference between the way an IT tool like that presents its information and the way an OT tool should present it. Because a lot of these guys say, we use this or that, and we couldn't make heads or tails of all the data we were getting out of this thing. So speak to that a little bit too.
Yeah, so I think, in searching for the tools, like I say, there are a lot of tools out there. There are a lot of those IT-centric tools that you have to exercise extreme caution. And then if you look at kind of that output of that, a lot of times that is very much formatted from an IT perspective, right? I've got this asset. This is its operating system. Maybe you're doing some CVE vulnerability asset scoring with it, but that in and of itself is not a risk quantification, because again, the impact, the consequence, the risk within the process itself is also very important. Again, looking at tools, there are tools that will do parts and pieces. Parts and pieces is expensive. Again, looking for that tool that kind of does everything. We have developed that tool that is that part and parcel, right? So it helps you understand your process flow. It puts your risk in context to the process flow so that you understand those risks to production. It's standards based with questionnaires. It is asset based, and so it is kind of that total collection. And I think that in general, as an industry, we need to be looking at these types of tools when we're doing our risk assessments and when we're doing our actual asset inventory, and we're trying to quantify what our risks are, as opposed to trying to do things in a piecemeal way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's right on spot. Chris Pinnell has a question. He wants to know, what's the best way to bridge IT and OT networks in order to pull operating data within systems like Ignition, and what tools should be present to minimize cross contamination? That's big.
Dual home hosts all the way. Just kidding. Dual home hosts, not the right answer.
No.
So, and I'm going to provide the broad answer, and I think Bill, I think you can round it out. But ultimately, when you're talking about IT versus OT and kind of bridging the communication there, number one, you don't want to have direct communication from your business network into your OT network. You want to have an intermediary or a DMZ, or what we call an IDMZ or industrial DMZ, and you want to have for polling, whether you're going or you're sending data to a historian, you want to have mirrored historian or polling servers in your DMZ, and you want to push from the OT into your DMZ. But ultimately, you don't want to have that direct communication. You certainly don't want to have dual home hosts. But the use of mirrored historians and polling servers in the DMZ, and pushing from the OT out to the DMZ, and I know that there's different vendors that have different configurations and they have different requirements that are completely counter to the best practices. But I think, the simple answer is if the TeamViewer incident has taught us anything, is that, you don't want direct access from the outside world into the OT. You want to expand upon that, Bill?
I don't know what I can expand upon. I mean, that's, I think to a certain extent, it's kind of common sense, right? So if you look at cyber and attack vectors, it's in most cases, if we're talking about true cyber, and we're not talking about thumb drive and things like that, it is that access to the internet, and the only way that you're truly going to mitigate that is your vulnerable networks, your more secure networks cannot have that direct path. And so whether that's with firewalls and DMZs, data diodes, something of that nature, mirrored servers, there has to be, that break between manufacturing and the manufacturing and the business networks. So, that's, unfortunately, that's the way of the world. Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to real quick. You mentioned the data diodes, and I just want to interject real quick about that. And that, there's a lot of people that I talk to that still don't feel like that data diodes are of value or work in an industrial environment, and it's just too cumbersome. And I'm gonna tell you right now, I've got a couple customers that use it, and those customers that I have that are using the data diode in their OT network to separate that in the DMZ or that in the business environment or whatever, is some of the most solid implementations of cyber defense in an OT network that I've seen. Huge fan of data diodes when it comes. So we're just talking about that. How do you secure that gap there and everything like that? There's a little bit of complexity involved in how do you manage that communication, that exfiltration of information, because one of the things you're doing is preventing bad exfiltration, right? And so how do you manage that polling and things like that? So there's some special configurations that are beyond this discussion that you'd get into, but it's possible. And big fan of data diodes, just by the way.
Awesome.
So
go ahead, Bill.
And I was going to say, so, something else kind of on that note, and it's something that at least we have been kind of exploring with some of the data analytics. Everybody talks about Industry 4.0 and how are we going to get this data out? How are we going to get it to the cloud? And, the process of Industry 4.0 is because now we have cheap processors, we have cheap network technology. And I think that in order to implement some of this and to do it in a fashion that we're meeting the objective without introducing risk into our control systems and things of that nature, is there are a lot of these network I/O devices that can be simply read only and established in a completely separate network. You know, our OT environments, we know their legacy protocols, we know their vulnerabilities. You know, it is complete and total network Ethernet isolation, right? And so I've seen and have been seeing more and more conversations of this kind of rethinking the way that we do, you know, interfaces to our data historians, the way that we do interfaces into our quality systems and interacting with our ERPs, to where and you know, basically it's that modified segmentation rule, right? So we're moving things into that segment, so that segment that is data collection, feeding data up to the business units, feeding data up into the cloud for analytics, is its own separate thing. And that way, technically, it cannot directly impact our real world equipment. So,
yeah, one quick thing from both of you, if you want, before we leave tools, is if you're a finance guy, or if you're in a CapEx spending position, where are you going to get your most bang for your buck when it comes to a tool? Go ahead, Clint.
I mean, again, it really depends on your situation, but I mean, I honestly do think that investing in some sort of risk management tool that's going to help you have your framework and your asset inventory, because here's the thing, a lot of risk management tools will also act sort of as a SIM, if you will, in order to pull in monitoring data, right? So if you can pull in data from a threat monitoring platform from OT, as well as some monitoring agents from IT, I think if you have the combined power of a risk management tool and a SIM, if you will, an aggregator, that can also kind of show you maturity over time, that sort of thing is going to be your best bang for your buck, because that's the hub for all those other pieces.
Yep. What do you got, Bill?
yeah, and I mean, I agree with that. I think if you have a limited budget, blindly throwing money into firewalls and intrusion detection systems without understanding the risk, and you know, it's send money to psychic friends, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean,
like that, right? You know,
you're exactly right, because that goes into what we've been saying, right? How do you create a targeted approach? It all starts with risk. So it makes sense that you need a risk management framework type tool, because that's going to help you make sense of all the other data you gather. So it's like
better capital expenditure decisions.
Yeah, you're putting the cart before the horse if you do everything else first. Start with that risk management tool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And you know, I know we've had internally, we've had these conversations with customers. You know, you look at these companies that are getting hit, and it's usually that little something that has been overlooked. You know, the team viewer, had they done an assessment, had they been paying attention to what industry standards were, and if they were following the right procedures and starting from the assessment and understanding what the risk was, understanding what their assets and their connectivity, it never would have happened. You know, thinking about these malware infiltrations, where they're getting into the point of either proactively shutting down their process to protect it, or you know, these processes getting infected. You know, had they taken the time to properly assess the risk, develop their plans, develop their recovery plans, and that ahead of time, rather than being that reactive model, would have, if not stopped it completely, would have greatly reduced the overall impact to these events.
Yeah, it's not one and done, right? I mean, you got to iterate on this stuff.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's an always evolving process, right? And I want to defend myself real quick. I saw a comment up there that Scott asked, Clint, are you advocating giant flat networks? Absolutely not. I'm advocating little flat networks, all segmented.
Little and flat.
Little flat networks that are all separated.
That's awesome. Air gapped or no?
I mean, everything's fixed if it's air gapped, right?
That's right.
I mean,
it's perfect. That's
USB proof.
utopia. Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, we're running a little bit short on time. Let's go ahead and wrap up. And if Bill, you want to summarize first, and then we'll let Clint kind of summarize what we're talking about today with a practical approach to industrial assessments. Go ahead.
Okay. So I guess to summarize, I hope if nothing else came out of this, your takeaway would be this: we know, because we watch TV, we see the news. We know that things are expanding. It's hard to quantify what that percent likelihood is of getting infected, but we know that that is on the increase. Hopefully, you also can at least agree that taking the blind approach, saying, well, gee whiz, there's Cisco tells me that if I buy this firewall, life is good. But if you don't know how to deploy the firewall, or you're not deploying it in the proper location, in the proper manner to protect your assets, you're kind of, you're closing your eyes and you're hoping for the best. And that old adage of security by obscurity doesn't apply anymore, because the nets that the adversaries are casting are wider and wider. I used to say they really didn't care whether they got a soccer mom, a hospital, a school, or manufacturing facility. They're just looking for cash flow. Now we're seeing that they're doing this big game hunting now, where they're actually targeting larger customers because they have deeper pockets. Hopefully the folks that own these large systems are at least reevaluating. We need to increase our critical thinking in how we're protecting our assets. And the only way that you're going to truly get that insight starts with risk assessment, and it starts with understanding your specific facility, how those impacts will impact your facility. And honest and true, if you look at the big picture, everybody thinks about the short term, but you look at the big picture. If I take out a factory that's in the middle of nowhere, Iowa someplace, or Kentucky, or whatever, the impact is not only to the shareholders of that company, it's larger than that. So it's all the employees, and then all the employees that feed into that community. So it is a much bigger thing, and
Complete supply chain. Yeah.
Complete supply chain. And I thought it was, don't want to talk too much about the colonial folks, but I thought it was interesting. I did see a thing today that the people, the perpetrators of this, said they weren't trying to make a social statement or anything. They were just making money. But it's amazing that impact and how quickly things can spiral.
All right, Clint, bring it home.
I'm going to give you a 20-second summary. Everything boils down to the risk. So identify your critical assets, identify the consequences of failure or loss, identify the impacts, identify the attack vectors, then identify the solutions.
I love that word, identify. I don't know why, but I do. All right, guys. Clint, it was awesome. Bill, it was awesome. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope everybody got a lot of good information. If you had to bounce early, or if you got to leave, we're going to wrap it up here, but we're going to make this available online. Just like I say, follow Clint, follow Bill on your favorite social media, follow GPA, follow ThreatGEN on your favorite social media, and you'll see a post for this. So again, thank you guys so much for taking the time out, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye, guys.